Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Glass and Glazing Federation webinar on the Future Home Standard. In particular, we'll be looking at the changes to approved document AL in England and with specific focus on the fenestration sector. I am Kevin Jones, Head of Technical for the Glass and Glazing Federation, and I'll be leading you through this webinar. I have with me John Manell, GGF Training Manager, who will be curating the Q&A session at the end of this webinar. So your microphones and cameras are all set to be turned off throughout this webinar, so please ask any questions in the Q&A tab at the top of your screens. We will be disabling the chat function to keep all the questions together in the Q&A session. You can upvote questions, so please do so if you see a question you would like answered, as we will prioritise those with the most upvotes first. So let's get into it. The GGF have been actively involved with MHCLG and the Building Safety Regulator throughout the Future Home Standard consultation period. We have become a reliable and consistent partner in the creation of the new approved documents. The GGF and its members have provided detailed, robust responses at every stage of the consultation process, and we continue to liaise with government now that the documents are published. This webinar will be recorded and made available to anyone who would like a copy. Toward the end of the slide deck, there are several QR codes. Some of these QR codes will link you to the documents that we'll be discussing today. And the last QR code will link you through to the form that will enable you to get the CPD certificate for attending this session and to leave us some feedback. Please do complete the feedback form, as we're always looking for ways we can improve the content of webinars going forward. So here you can see the main topics that we'll be covering today. So we'll be discussing what is the Future Home Standard, what is the updated detail of approved document AL, some information about notional and limiting U values for windows and doors. We'll also cover off the U value requirements for fire doors going forward, the change in methodology of U value calculation that's come in the new version. We'll be talking you through the ancillary inclusions and the exclusions in that U value calculation method. And we've got some coverage on SAP 10.3 and the home energy model softwares. And then we'll finish off with transitional timelines and then a Q&A session at the end. So the scope of the Future Home Standard applies to new build dwellings in England only, and it is delivered through changes to building regulations supported by the approved documents. The policy journey began in 2019 when government first committed to introducing the Future Home Standard, followed by an early consultation activity. An interim uplift to Part L and Part F was implemented in June 2022, setting a stepping stone forward towards the full standard. The most recent full technical consultation took place in 2023, with the government response published on the 24th of March 2026, alongside the final approved documents. The Future Home Standard was formally published on the 24th of March 26, with regulations coming into force from 24th of March 2027, confirming the direction of travel for fabric performance and placing windows and doors firmly at the centre of compliance. So the Future Home Standard is about raising standards for new homes in England, targeting a 75 to 80% lower carbon emissions compared with current building regulations. This places a much stronger focus on how the building envelope performs as a whole and ensures that the as-built dwelling performs as close to the as-designed dwelling as possible. A key requirement is improved insulation and air tightness. Windows and doors play a critical role here. Poor specification or installation can undermine the performance of the entire home. The move to low-carbon heating systems, such as heat pumps, means homes must retain heat far more effectively. High-performance glazing and well-fitted frames are essential to making these systems work efficiently. There is also greater emphasis on more accurate U value calculations for glazing going forward. This means better alignment between tested performance, declared values, and real-world installation. No more room for assumptions. Overall, the use of high-quality materials is no longer optional. For the window and door sector, this reinforces the importance of compliant products, correct specification, and skilled installation. All of this supports the UK's wider commitment to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, with windows and doors recognised as a key contributor, no longer just a finishing detail. So now we'll look at some of the ways that the Future Homes Standard aims to improve building performance. First up is energy storage. Homes are expected to more frequently incorporate on-site energy storage to better capture and use low-carbon electricity generated within the dwelling. Solar panels. Solar PV will become a more common feature on new homes to offset operational carbon emissions and reduce reliance on electricity from the grid. Heat recovery. Greater use of mechanical ventilation with heat recovery is anticipated to retain warmth in highly insulated, airtight homes. Increased loft insulation. Loft insulation levels will increase to further reduce heat loss through the roof and support lower space heating demand. Increased wall insulation. Wall insulation standards will be strengthened to improve thermal performance and minimize the fabric heat losses. And we have an increase in air tightness. So the air tightness requirements will tighten significantly, placing greater importance on detailing around openings such as windows and doors. And of course, high performance windows and doors. Windows will need to deliver consistently lower U values and improved real-world performance, making specification and installation critical to overall compliance. So within the approved document AL1 for dwellings, we have a small change in the wording, which presents a massive impact on the supply chain. So we'll focus on the updates in approved document AL1 for dwellings, which, as part of the consultation, has undergone a title change from the Conservation of Fuel and Power to the new title of Energy and Greenhouse Gas Emissions. There have been some small changes in the wording, but as I said, they will have a big impact on the door and glazing supply chain. The publication of ADL Volume 1 for dwellings has confirmed much of what the sector had been preparing for following the MHCLG consultation process. From a technical perspective, notional and limiting U values remain unchanged, providing continuity for specification, but the method used to calculate those U values has changed quite significantly. Ancillary items are now included, increasing the scope of what must be assessed. There is a significant increase in calculation requirements because of the method of calculation change. In some cases, compliance will drive the need for triple glazing. Overall, the published standard confirms the central role of fabric performance, and particularly windows and doors, in achieving compliance under the Future Homes Standard. Now we can look at each of these in a little more detail. So notional and limiting U values to remain the same. So notional U values for windows and doors with more than 60% glazed area are 1.2. For doors less than 60% glazed area, the notional U value is 1. The limiting U values for all of these products is 1.6. All of these U values rather are now area weighted averages. Whereas previous versions of approved document AL presented a notional and limiting U value that applied to an isolated one-off frame, we now have an area weighted average of the windows and doors across the dwelling. So now is also a good time to talk through what the difference is between notional and limiting U values are and why we have both. So a notional building U value specification has existed for some time. Within it are U values for lots of different building elements, including walls, roofs, and of course, windows and doors. This specification is a recipe of sorts, with each building element representing a different ingredient. It is possible and perfectly acceptable for a building designer to change the recipe. For example, they may choose to improve the wall insulation from 100 mm cavity to 150 mm cavity. By doing so, it would allow for a relaxing of a different element, with the increase in wall insulation making up the difference. So, while we have the notional building specification, we also have the limiting U value tables within ADL. This presents us with a backstop for each building element that cannot be breached no matter what improvements are made elsewhere. So, as we can see here, the notional U-value for windows is 1.2. Many specifications are expected to ask for 1.3 because they are improving a different element elsewhere. It is worth noting that the notional U-value table has been removed from the new version of ADL. It can, however, be found in SAP 10.3 and also in a separate document dedicated to notional U-values. The limiting U-value table remains within ADL. So now we can take a look at U-value requirements for fire doors, and this slide breaks it down eventually into new build and domestic replacement as well. So for new build, we have a notional U-value for fire doors with more than 60% glazed area as 1.2, and for notional U-values for doors with less than 60% glazed area, the notional is 1. The limiting U-value of these for new build is 1.6. So when we come on to the replacement market, you can see that the limiting U-value for replacement fire doors is 1.8. So this is one of the few queries that we've posed to government, as the products are very often the same for both new build and domestic replacement. Early consultation discussions with MHCLG were had about both the new build and domestic replacement fire doors having the same limiting U-value of 1.8 due to the complexity of products and challenges they present when it comes to U-values. We actually have quite a list of queries that we've sent to government for a number of items within the documents, both the English and the Welsh versions. And as soon as we get answers to a lot of those queries, we will publish those through our LinkedIn, through our socials. So keep an eye out for those, because there are quite a few big questions that we've got. So this is a side-by-side comparison of the new and old approved document L1 publications. So the new document is on the left-hand side there. And the first comparison is the method of calculation for U-values for windows and doors. So the 2021 version on the right shows windows and doors as separate sections. So we have section 4.2, which covers windows, and section 4.3, which covers doors. In the 2026 version, you can see on the left there, they are now together all in section 3.2. So as you can see there, section 3.2, new dwellings, covers windows and doors together. This is where a small but significant change has been introduced. So option B of 4.2 and 4.3 in the 2021 version has been removed. So no longer can we rely on the standard size and style method of calculation. So historically, we've been able to calculate a single window at 1230 wide by 1480 high, and that window includes a side next to fixed style with a central mullion. And once you've calculated that one single window, we're able to apply that result across the family of products, no matter what the size and style that were actually installed. So that gave us a single calculation, which then covered the family of products, and you didn't have to calculate the individuals. The removal of this option only leaves us now with two choices: calculate the actual size and style of each individual frame, or measure using the hotbox method. The hotbox method is a test carried out in laboratory conditions and is not currently available anywhere in the UK that I'm aware of. So that really only leaves us with option B of section 3.2, which says calculated using the actual size and configuration of the window in line with BSEN ISO 10077 parts 1 and 2. Many within the supply chain are already working on calculation tools because the sheer amount of calculations that will be required, it's not feasible or possible from a commercial or productivity standpoint to carry out calculations on every single window and door that are installed. So, as I said, many within the supply chain are already working on these calculation tools, and we expect to start seeing them come online over the coming months. So here you can see section 3.3 of the new ADL 2026 on the left-hand side there. This section details the extra items that now need to be considered in the window and door U-value calculation. So this list was written by the GGF Consultation Response Group at the request of MHCLG. During the consultation, it was made clear to us that everything within the window and door aperture should be calculated going forward. Historically, when using the standard size and style frame, only the frame, sash, one central mullion and the glass were included. As you can see here, many more items now need to be calculated. And we can go down the list. So we've got actual frame sections, for example, different width outer frames. So if you have a window where you're using a large head, perhaps to allow for trickle ventilation, then that window frame needs to be calculated with the large head, not just an intermediate, what we would have done historically. Any sills and different thresholds, the actual sill or threshold that's on the product will need to be calculated going forward. Add-ons and frame extenders. So any additional non-structural element that extends the size of the frame. So on a PVC window, for example, it would be very common to use a 15mm extender or 30mm extender if you were installing into check reveal, for example. Or certainly on an open-in door, very common to see a 15mm add-on applied to an open-in front door. So these frames will now have to be calculated, including that add-on section wherever it appears. Also dummy sashes. So non-opening sash or vent that is fixed in place. Dummy transoms and mullions as well. So these are very common to improve the aesthetic of a site, very often found at the curbside facing side of the site for that curb appeal. But these do have an impact on the U-value calculation, which we'll talk about a little more in a moment. But if you have windows that employ dummy sashes and dummy transoms, these will also need to be included in those calculations. And it's also stressing the fact that decorative glazing bars within the glazing unit cavity, for example, Georgian bars or duplex, need to be included in the calculation. Now, these have been something that always should have been included in the calculations, but have very often been missed historically. So there'll be an increased focus on making sure that if you have windows and doors in situ that have these glazing bars, that they are taken into account during the U-value calculation process. And finally, option G there, we've got non-dead load bearing couplers. So a PVC H coupler, or perhaps an aluminium coupler that's being used for wind load purposes that isn't dead load bearing. So there is one notable exception to the inclusions list, and that is dead load bearing components. So these are to be excluded from the calculations. So the rationale behind this is that these components, structural bay poles are a good example of this, are designed primarily to take a load. To improve their thermal efficiency would likely reduce their capacity to take the loads that they are intended for. Okay, so businesses at the moment are looking very carefully at their family of products and trying to put into buckets, if you like, which couplers are dead load bearing and which are primarily for connection of one frame to another, or to enable to achieve the correct wind load capacity. So in those scenarios, if you're just connecting frames, or if you're using a coupler for wind load bearing capacity, then those will need to be included in the calculation for U-value. If you have items that are designed to take a dead load, such as two-part structural couplers or structural bay poles, then those elements are not included in the window calculations. The GGF is working on a support document for approved document L, which details all of these different items in much more depth. And we have examples of diagrams, general arrangements, and cross sections in there that cover PVC, aluminium, and timber frames across all of these options. So, and that document should be published within the next 6 to 8 weeks. And that will be freely available to anybody that wants to download it from our website. So there'll be no fee or no hidden behind membership login. It will be freely available to anyone that needs it. And we're hoping that that document will clearly lay out and explain all of these elements so that there's no doubt within the industry as to exactly what should be included in the calculations and the items that you can omit from the calculations. Because this is quite a big change to where we have been historically in the domestic space. And so we're just keen that people have the correct information to get this right. So this slide just gives an illustration of some of the things that we've been talking about there around the inclusions in the calculation. So we're looking here for this example, we've got the standard window, which is 1230, 1480, side next to fixed with a central mullion. So that's where we were calculating up to this point. But this particular window, we've already added the sill onto that, which needs to be included in the calculation. And then we can see the dummy sash coming into it. Dummy transoms. And of course, the Georgian bars or decorative glazing bars, could be duplex back-to-back spacer as well. So as you can see there, that's the final window with all of the items added, with the exception to add-ons. So all of those will have to be included in the calculation going forward. And now we can look at a generic window system that we had calculations for, just to see what impact they actually have. So this slide shows the compound impact on U value from some of the ancillary additions that we've spoken about. And first we start with what was the standard size and style window, and that gives us in the top right there the standard U value of 1.266. So that U value for declaration purposes will be rounded up, so we would get a 1.3 U value with the standard window specification. When we add the dummy sash into it, we're looking at a 1.269. So as you can see, very, very small minor difference there. Wouldn't make a difference on the rounding up or down. Then as we add in the dummy sash to that, dummy transoms to that, it takes it to 1.319. So we're starting to see an incremental difference there, the compound effect of these different elements, but still not a huge difference to make much of a concern. But then when we start adding in the internal decorative glazing bars, such as Georgian, then that is quite a jump. So we're now up to 1.446. Now, bearing in mind, this is a specific window system, work that we did with some other systems, that would push that past the 1.45 round, which would be rounding up to 1.5. So potentially you're seeing a 0.2 difference in performance from adding those three items. Where you see a much more significant difference is if you change the Georgian grid to an aluminium duplex back-to-back style spacer bar, and then we start to see a much bigger difference. So we're up to the 1.6 rounded now. And so, you know, that's quite a difference, and it would take a very good triple glazing specification to bring that particular window back down to your 1.3 or even 1.2 if the notion is what's being asked for. And so window and door design needs to be considered now more than it ever has done before. So it could push projects into full triple glazing in some cases. So communication with the builders and building designers has never been more important. As examples, we've been in contact with some of the house builders and discussing with them the importance of that window design, where they need to consider now, if they want the dummy sash, dummy transoms and the Georgian designs, for example, then they need to consider that that's likely that that's going to push the specification into triple glazing, which is fine if that's what they're happy doing, but obviously there's a cost implication to that to them. But what we didn't want them to do is carry on specifying these design of windows and not understanding the impact that it will have on the calculation and indeed the glass specification going forward. So as I said, we've been talking to lots of house builders, making them aware of these changes and the impact that that window design and door design can have on the final calculations. So we can now go through the change in thermal modelling software for buildings. So historically, we have always had SAP software for modelling buildings. This will change in the near future. So the new software that will replace SAP is called the Home Energy Model, or HEMS for short. Unfortunately, the Home Energy Model software has been delayed. We are told that the delay will be for at least 3 months from the date of publication of the document. So that was the 24th of March. So at least a 3-month delay from the 24th of March. In response to that delay, a new updated version of SAP has been developed called SAP 10.3. This is available immediately for use. To aid developers with the eventual change from SAP to HEM, both software options will run side by side for at least 2 years after the HEM is launched. So government have advised that they will give industry at least 6 months notice of the phase out of SAP 10.3. So we have at least a 3-month delay to the home energy model, and people we're talking to within industry actually expect that to be possibly more than 3 months, so at least 3-month delay there. Then as the HEM model comes online, it will run concurrently with SAP 10.3 for at least 2 years. And then we will get at least a 6-month notice period from government to say we're changing over at this point in time. So why do we have the HEM model? So the new HEM software is a much more accurate tool. So for example, HEM uses half-hourly calculation time steps compared to SAP's monthly. So it's a much more detailed, much more accurate, much more live version of the software. The HEM software will allow shading from surrounding objects to be modeled now, and it has much more detail on thermal elements is required for the HEM, such as their orientation, for example. Which does add some complication with the inputs because each window needs to be inputted individually. For example, if you have a 3-part square bay, each of those window inputs will be very different because you'll be inputting the actual size and style of those windows. There's also an area in the HEM software where you need to input the free opening area of all the sashes as well. But also on that 3-part bay, you're going to have different orientation of the windows. So you could have one north, one east, and one south, for example. So there will be slight differences, and the ways that we input that data will change as well, and a lot more data required. But the point of all of this is to ensure a much more accurate model is produced. So we are working more towards the as-built being closer to the as-designed than we've ever seen before. And an example of that is when we ran some simulations of a very generic 3-bed semi-detached house, which is built all over the UK. The declared U value was 1.3 because on the standard size and style window, that's what we had. You translate that frame specification and glass specification into the actual size and style of the windows, and it was closer to 1.6. So quite a gap in performance there. So the home energy model is asking for that area weighted average. It's asking for actual calculations for size and style of the products, including all those items that we've spoken about. And that in turn gives you a much more accurate, detailed U value simulation. And that's part of the reason why we went away from the 0.8 specification that many people were expecting. So very early on in the consultation process, government were telling us that they were going much more down the fabric first approach, and we would see a requirement for 0.8 U value across windows and doors. When the software modeling got underway, it became apparent that actually the 1.2 notional would be good enough for what they needed to achieve, so long as it actually was 1.2 that was installed. Okay, so that need for much more accurate information really is born out of that piece of modeling that they did early on in the consultation. So now we will start to look at some of the timelines for implementation. So there's 2 separate timelines within the approved document. One is for non-higher risk building work, and then the other is obviously for higher risk building work. So we're going to look at non-high risk building work first off. So we have the documents published on the 24th of March 2026, and that kick-started a 12-month lead-in period. After that 12-month lead-in period, which takes us to the 24th of March 2027, the 12-month transition begins, which takes us through to March 2028. So at that point, the transition is finished. And what this means is that for projects where building application or initial notice is in place before the 24th of March 2027, and work starts before the 24th of March 28, then the existing 21-22 regulations can apply. However, if the building application or initial notice is not registered before the 24th of March 27, or building work doesn't start before the 24th of March 2028, then the new 26 regulations will apply. A couple of changes around how you register a start on site and also how the transition applies. So these transitions will apply on a plot by plot basis, whereas historically a builder has been able to register a phase of a site which might incorporate 50, 60, 100 buildings. But government are very keen to try and not have the legacy of old sign-offs for old regulations that we've seen historically. And so one of the ways in doing that is to do this by a plot by plot basis. Okay, so the plot needs to be registered and started before 2028 for you to use the old regulations. But they've also changed the requirements of what quantifies as a start as well. So historically, we were able to either put a drainage channel in or a foundation, and you could say that that plot has been started. So information that we're starting to get back from some developers is that they're being told that they will need to do much more than that for that plot to be considered started. Some going so far as to suggest that it might actually be the completion of the ground floor or very close to it before you're able to satisfy the requirements that that plot is started. And so, you know, as I said, government are very keen to move away from the long legacy timelines that we've seen in previous building regulation changes, where sometimes 2, 3, and even 4 years after the fact, we're still using the old regulations for sign-off because of the way the sites were started. So moving on to higher risk building work. So a very similar timeline, but we have a 6-month extension to the laying date or the lead-in period, if you like. So again, documents were published on the 24th of March 2026, at which point the 18-month lead-in period begins, so 6 months more than the non-higher risk buildings, which takes us through to the 24th of September 2027. At which point a 12-month transition begins. So it's only the lead-in period which has been extended, and we've still got a 12-month transition period. So September 2028, 12-month transition ends, and all builds starting after this period must comply. And so the same rules are in place for this transition as the non-high risk building work. It will apply by building or by plot. And there's the same registration and initial notice before September 27, and then work starts before September 28, and you'll be on the old regulations. Assuming an initial notice or planning consent after September 27, or work doesn't start until after 2028, then you're into the 2026 new regulations. Okay. So the key takeaways: notional and limiting window and door U values remain the same. Changing calculation method for windows and doors, leading to a huge increase in calculation requirements. And as we mentioned, many of the system houses and larger fabricators are working towards some sort of calculation tools. And I think the holy grail for that is that you end up with a calculation tool that can talk to your estimating software, because I don't think we can underestimate just how big an impact on the industry that is going to be. It's almost a doubling of the work. And in my mind, you can't prepare quotations until you have the U value set, because that will inform what glass specification you need to prepare a quotation for. So it almost requires somebody doing a takeoff of a site, plugging it through a U value calculator first, before they can even start looking at the estimating software. So it's a doubling of all of the work. So I think eventually in the future, we hope to get to a point where these U-value calculators will talk to the estimating software so that people can perform their estimates within whatever software package they're using, and it will automatically pull from a U-value calculator in the background the U-value for that specific window and door. And then it would also be nice if it could give you an area weighted average at the end of that plot being estimated as well. Some other nice to haves in that software would be a calculation tool that works out the free opening area of all the sashes, because that is now a requirement going forward under the new HEM model. And I think if you can get all of that working nicely together, then that's probably, you know, the ultimate wish list, if you like, for that calculation tools. And of course, those tools are going to need to include the ancillary items. So as we spoke in detail earlier on, the add-ons, the sills, the packers, dummy sash, dummy transoms, and all of that glazing specification, whether it's Georgian bars, decorative bar, or otherwise. And the new modelling software in the form of the home energy model, a much more detailed and accurate way of modelling buildings. So that will just improve the accuracy of the data going into the building to make sure the as built is closer to the as designed, which is ultimately what we're trying to achieve with all of this. And then there needs to be a much better understanding of the window and door design and the impact that that will have on U values, because it's never been more important. We've never had to really consider it up to this point for domestic dwellings, whereas going forward, it's going to be a huge consideration. And that change in design, small change in design, can completely change the glass specification of the whole plot, potentially. And finally, the transition timeline has been set, so the clock is ticking. So I just want to talk very briefly now about a couple of the changes in approved document L2 for non-domestic dwellings, and then we'll also touch a little bit on approved document L1 for Wales. So I don't have slides for this, it's just some information I'd like to share while we've got time, because we are running a little bit in front. So approved document L2, so non-domestic buildings in England. There is a small change in the calculation methodology, but not to the extent that we've seen in approved document 1. So the options for U-value calculation in ADL2, of which we have 4 options. So option 1 is calculate using the actual size and configuration of the window. So that again is a calculation for each and every single window and door that is supplied. You also have 2 options which are very similar. For windows in buildings similar to dwellings, calculated for the standard window, so the 1230 1480 window, but you're using the actual configuration of the window, so that might be a top over side next to fixed, for example. Or you have option C, which is for windows in buildings similar to dwellings again, calculate for a standard size and style window using the standard design. So for buildings that are not similar to dwellings, then you are using the actual size and style configuration, similar to the change in ADL1. But if you have buildings that are similar to dwellings, then you can revert back to the old method of calculation, which ironically is no longer allowed in approved document L1 for dwellings. Okay. So that's just an important point to take note of if you are in that space. Now, coming on to approved document L1 in Wales. So this was published a little after the English version, and I'm very pleased to say that it's almost a carbon copy of the English version. And so section 3.2, which is on page 34 of ADL1 in Wales, it tells us that we are having to do the actual size and style configuration for the U-value calculation, the same as in England, or the hotbox method. So the 2 options that you have for U-value calculation in Wales going forward are exactly the same as the options that we have in England. And they've also copy and pasted in the list of extras that we've spoken about for England. So the actual frame sections, the sills and thresholds, the add-ons and frame extenders, dummy sashes, dummy transoms and mullions, and decorative glazing bars within the cavity unit, etc. It also includes the very same exclusions as well. So any dead load bearing components, for example, the bay poles that we spoke about, you don't have to include those in the calculation for the same reasons. So the only really notable change around U values for windows and doors between the Welsh and the English domestic dwellings ADL is that the limiting U value for windows and doors in England is 1.6. However, in Wales, the window or roof window is 1.4, as are all the doors. So a slightly lower U value on the limiting factor. Now, in reality, I don't think this makes much of a difference. There isn't many scenarios I can foresee somebody actually requesting a U value below 1.3 or 1.4 anyway. In fact, we haven't seen requests at 1.5 or 1.6 for some time. And so given the changes in calculation methodology and the improvements that we're trying to achieve, it's very unlikely that you'll see anything past 1.4 anyway. So for all intents and purposes, they are very, very similar documents. So what we've got here is 3 QR codes. The first one will take you to the consultation outcome and the documents, and then we have a specific QR code for approved document L in England, and also another one for approved document F. So I'll just leave that up on the screen for a short moment so that everybody can get a screenshot or photograph. Okay. So now we've got some time for questions. So please use the Q&A tab at the top of the screen if you've got any questions. And like I said, upvote the ones that you would like to see an answer to, because we will try and prioritize those. But any questions that we don't get to or don't have answers to, we will be looking to produce a Q&A crib sheet, if you like, off the back of this webinar, which we will send out to everybody that registered. And also everybody that registered should get a copy of the recording and a transcript from AI alongside it as well. And you'll probably see that come to you today. So what I'll do before we come to John with the questions, I will skip to the next screen, which is the QR code, which allows you to obtain your CPD certificate. So you will need to scan that code while we're going through the questions. That will present you with an online form which you can complete with all of your details. You will then get a CPD certificate for attending this webinar. And as I said earlier on in the slide deck, we are looking for feedback from you guys, because we are keen to know what worked and what you thought we could do better, so that webinars in the future can be as good as they possibly can be. And keep a lookout for links going forward. We'll be producing further webinars specifically on ADL2 potentially in England, and also the approved documents across Wales, including L, F and O. And we're also hoping to see a consultation for approved document Q in England. So that's security in dwellings. We're hoping to see that come through either just before summer or just after the summer recess for government. As soon as that comes out, we will hold a similar webinar to this to talk through what the proposed changes are for approved document Q, because that one is shaping up to be quite impactful on our industry in a number of different ways. So it would be helpful, I think, to go through that with everyone. So John, over to you. Do we have any questions?
Yes, so firstly, thanks for that, Kev, and can already see my inbox filling with people wanting their CPD certificates. And so, Kevin, there was over 200 at one point, so clearly a topic brilliant. We need to provide guidance for. Starting with a couple of easy ones. You have mentioned that we'll distribute the recording. Would the slide deck be available? Can we distribute that following the presentation?
Yes, the recording, the slide deck and a transcript will be available, and yeah, feel free to share it far and wide.
And the last slightly easier question, only because it's been asked a couple of times, is in the calculation of the window, there was no mention of the change the window sill will have on the U value calculation. Could you please clarify this?
Yes, so it depends. So using a PVC window as an example, what we found was if you're adding a stub sill, so like an 85mm sill perhaps, or a 125 sill or a 150 sill, it does have a negative impact on the U value, but very, very small. It's a 0.0 something impact, very similar to the dummy sash. So on its own, not enough to, in most cases, round up or down the U value. But along with the compound effect, it does have it. But when you had all of those items that we looked at, including the sill, it is bringing a 1.3 window generally to around 1.6. In which case what we've seen is a very good 36mm triple glazed unit will mitigate that difference and bring it back down into the realms of 1.3. But obviously, bear in mind when you're looking at that slide deck, that is one very specific window system. Others will vary slightly, but not that much, to be honest. There's not a huge difference between one from the other, unless you're using specialist window systems designed specifically for low U values that might be a 90mm system as opposed to a 70mm system, for example. But once you go over the 150 sills into 180, 200, 225 and 250 in some cases, then what we actually see is a very slight improvement to the U value. And we think why that is because those larger sill sections have many more chambers within them. So that actually performs better than the 30mm frame that it's replacing. Okay, so again, very minute improvement, not enough to really round up or down, but it's a win, so we'll take it. The bigger the sill, the more likely it is to have a very slight positive impact on the U value.
Thanks, Kev. So the most upvoted one, there's two currently. So how are glazing bars to be assessed using the full EN 10077 part 1 or 2 assessment, or using the centre pane U value offsets as outlined in EN 14351?
So within the rules that we've got, you can use either. So I think it's Annex J, there's a table in 14351, and that gives you I think 4 or 5 different options. So it tells you if you have a single bar, if you have a crossbar, or if you have full grid, and it gives you just a standardized deduction to make on the U value. And I think it's 0.1 and 0.2 for the single and full grid, if I remember correctly. So you can use those within the calculation because they are there in our harmonized standard 14351, or you can actually calculate using the standard as mentioned. So what we found in the work that we've done, certainly on a single and a crossbar, a calculation is more favorable generally than the tabulated values in 14351. But the results were a little inconsistent when it came to full grid or back-to-back spacer bar. We had some instances where it was favorable to calculate, but in other instances it wasn't. So it's worth doing on the particular system that you're using, if you have the ability to get some calculations done just to see. You might find in some cases you're better off using that standard tabulated value, but in other cases you might be better to calculate. But I think over time, as we get experience of doing this more and more, I think industry will figure out, which of those two methods, generally speaking, gives you the best result that you're after.
Thanks, Kev. It's dropped down a little bit because it's in relation to that last question. Is there any info on whether or not those calculations integrated into your estimator must be third-party accredited, or just need to have been performed according to BSEN 10077?
Sorry, can you ask that again? You broke up a minute.
Is there any info on whether or not those calculations integrated into your estimator must be third-party accredited?
Okay, so within approved document Al, nowhere does it ask for accredited U values. So we did speak to government about this during the consultation process, and a recommendation from us and others in the industry were that they should be accredited U values. And the page that we wrote for government with the consultation response group at the GGF, which included Trade Federation representation from CAB, British Windows, British Plastics Federation, British Woodworking Federation, and the Steel Window and Door Association. So it was a broad range of trade federations and their members that were involved in that. We listed out all the items to be included to try and make it understandable for people. We also had 2 other comments at the bottom, one of which was that we felt the U-value should be accredited by a third party, or indeed the calculators that people use should be verified and accredited by a third party, which is probably the way we envisaged it travelling. But those comments never made it into the final document. So we know they were on that sheet that we sent to government. So it's a deliberate omission on part of government to not include that statement. I'm not clear really as to why that is. However, when you are calculating U values for 14351 and producing your declarations of performance, within that area, there is a need that the U values are accredited. So document L doesn't tell you to do it, but 14351 kind of does say that they need to be accredited.
Thanks, Kev. So just to clarify, we will be putting a brief response to all of the questions that are here following the webinar, but also you did say that we would be providing a support document for calculation. Do you know when that would be available?
Yeah, so we think between 6 and 8 weeks, and it's a very, very cleanly laid out, simple document, which is just highlighting all of these extra components that we need to include calculations for going forward. And like I said, there's drawings, general arrangements of different material types, so that there's hopefully no doubt as to exactly what components the approved document is telling you need to include. So that's the view of that. The GGF also have a couple of other documents which are referenced in approved document R. One is 2.2, which is the calculation of U values for windows and doors, and the other one is 2.3, which is the calculation of energy ratings for windows and doors. So now that we have the finished published document, ADL, we are updating both of those documents to reflect the changes. So they are much more detailed documents, proper technical data sheets, if you like, that cover all the different aspects of U-value calculation, methodology, and its application across different areas. So declaration of performance versus ADL, for example. They will take some time, but I'm hoping that we can get both of those updated and published either toward the end of this year or for the start of next year. So those documents are freely available to GGF members, but anyone outside of GGF membership can purchase them for a very small fee through our website shop, which should be launching around summertime.
That's great, thanks, Kev. There's a couple of questions actually which sort of relate to, I guess, market information. And it's something we're seeing more, I think, with the product reform white paper. But I guess in summary, one of the questions says, given that there is no net size, how do you see people will market, and more importantly, CE or UKCA mark a product, presumably in regards to its thermal performance?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, and I don't have a straight answer for it at the moment. So in terms of CE marking your products, we were asked by a couple of different government departments to look at declaration of performances for windows and doors, specifically the U value, because there's been a question mark raised at some audits around whether or not it's acceptable to put a U value and then equal to or better than. So then that allows you to prepare your U value based on the standard size and style window, which is the requirement currently of 14351, and then declare that for a range of products, which may be at least that performance, but probably better in a lot of cases. So there's a piece of work going on at the moment, and the first indications are that people generally are in agreement that you will be allowed to put, for example, a 1.6 U value as the limiting value on your DOP equal to or better than. And then the individual performance criteria would be at sign-off stage into the home energy model, where you would have to provide the data to show that the U values are what you claim they are. So that the simulation reports from a calculator or whatever that might look like. What was the first part of the question, John? Sorry, there was two parts to them.
Well, there was a couple of questions which were very similar. I'll just quickly scroll back down. It was, how do people market, and more importantly, CE / UKCA mark? So presumably the marketing side around the standard size.
Yes, that was it. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so again, that's a very difficult one. I think we'll see lots of different companies doing it in different ways. And I think we need to be very careful as an industry as to the claims that we make going forward. The single construction regulator and the construction reform white paper, a lot of the consultation detail in there is around evidencing your claims. So if you are claiming a U value, you need to be able to evidence that exactly. And so that becomes quite challenging because in theory, there's no actual U value target, if you like, because depending on the size of star, you're gonna have lots of different U values, so potentially lots of different claims. So I think most will probably still declare on the standard size and style, because we have a precedent for that with our harmonized standard in 14351. And in fact, that is going to be a preferable U value as well, because it's a much bigger frame than most domestic dwelling new build. You're getting a better U value generally using the same glass spec because you've got a higher glass to frame ratio. And so I think that for me makes sense that carries on as it is. But just a word of caution, part of the early consultation process that government undertook was around looking at websites to see what sort of U values are possible within the industry. And that's really where the drive for 0.8 came from for government initially, which they obviously rode back on in favour of 1.2. But when we spoke to government at the time, they said, well, we've looked at lots of websites and everybody is claiming they can do a 0.8 U value. So what's the problem? And the problem was, the small print to a lot of those claims were it's only available in this huge fixed pane window, which isn't realistic for what's actually going to be applied in buildings. So we need to be careful as an industry about making claims that aren't robust and have all of the evidence behind it.
Yeah, definitely.
Time for one more, maybe, John?
Yeah, not sure if this is a short version, but are mandatory trickle vents included in the future home standard U value calculations in the same way as seals and add-ons, or are they ignored like load-bearing bay poles?
They are ignored, as they always have been. So trickle vents are not included in U value calculation. There's been a lot of discussion over whether they should be or shouldn't be, but the line has fell down on the side of not including them. And I am aware that some businesses have actually performed calculation with trickle vents in, and there's even been some hotbox testing done over in Europe as well. And some of the findings, they're not as impactful as you might think. And I think the theory goes sort of certainly on the inside, you're routing out one, again, using PVC as an example, you're routing out one skin of PVC and replacing it with another. Because the U value calculation doesn't take into account the air permeability of the product, it is just that thermal transmission, then one piece of plastic is removed, another piece of plastic is applied. So the actual change to U value calculation isn't that much. The only time you see a significant change is if it's calculated in the open position. But yeah, a short answer, they're not included.
Thanks, Kev. Well, I will make sure we export all these questions, get back and distribute those. Appreciate everyone that's joined today. And we'll be bringing the webinar to a close, and hopefully following the success of this, as Kevin mentioned, we will be looking at others going forward. But thank you, everyone. I've seen over 100 feedback forms come back, so we'll make sure we get the certificates distributed as soon as possible. So thanks, Kev.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Goodbye.